the proposals the government has come up with to try to affect a change in the atmosphere of some of those minority communities you've been describing, particularly the Muslim community, is to introduce a law which would prohibit the incitement of religious hatred. You're opposed to that?
I am, yes. I think it was a disastrous policy, and I think that, with the greatest of respect, it was advanced by some campaigners who were naive about how to advance the cause of disenfranchised young Muslims in this country, and how to protect the vulnerable. The problem is this: religion is faith, but it's also a body of ideas. And, people have to be allowed to robustly critique that body of ideas. But no one's proposing
that you can't robustly critique religion in the terms of this legislation.
Well, they are actually. I mean, the legislation has been diluted to some extent, and mercifully, by the active engagement of both houses of Parliament. But it still allows for too much ambiguity, because at the end of the day, this is an attack on religion, is an attack on a body of ideas. And it's not an immutable characteristic like race and so on. And the problem is this: people campaigned for this, and the offence was passed. And some people in good faith thought they were advancing the cause of Muslims. This is while Muslims are in Guantanamo Bay and Belmarsh and all the rest of it, and not campaigning on those grounds, but on this totemic speech offence. Let's have it as a symbol of parity of esteem. And then what happens? After the atrocity that is the 7th of July, the government responds with another package of legislative and other measures, and on that list is another speech offence, this time called encouraging or glorifying terrorism. This time, presumably, the offence is aimed not at those who criticise Islam, but at those who criticise, I don't know, President Bush or whatever. And the problem
that's
is
your analysis of the motivation.
My speech is free, and yours is a bit more expensive.
But that's your analysis of the motivation behind this legislation. In Northern Ireland, there are already laws which ban incitement to religious hatred. Laws which go back to 1970, which have been updated since. Laws which prohibit the stirring up of fear or hatred on the grounds of religious belief, colour, race, nationality or ethnic groups. You could hardly describe Northern Ireland as a culture where the robust discussion of religion has been somehow reduced on the basis of that legislation.
At the end of the day, free speech, like privacy that we were talking about earlier, is a qualified right. And I do accept that right-thinking, progressive human rights people can just disagree about this offence or that offence in its particular formulation, about what is, at a moment in time, in a particular society, a necessary and proportionate interference with free speech. I accept that, and I'm not qualified to talk about how these laws have operated in Northern Ireland.
They've hardly ever been applied. There are hardly any convictions.
And sometimes when speech offences are used in democracies, they end up being used against the very people that they were intended to protect. The price of free speech is that sometimes you defend speech that you detest. But I think, generally speaking, we've got to make a separation between what is appropriate for the criminal law and what is appropriate for individual ethical courtesy and conduct. And that separation is, I think, a sign of the health of a robust democracy.
In opposition to those kinds of legislative proposals, you are a great champion of the Human Rights Act, a Charter for Civil Liberties, which has a fairly bad press at the minute in Britain. It is seen by some people, perhaps encouraged by tabloid newspapers, you might say, as a charter for criminals, terrorists and misfits. You have to accept it's having a PR problem at the minute.
I certainly do. The narrative of human rights, the story of human rights, the Human Rights Act, is played out where? It's played out in the courts and in the media and in the context of the war on terror. But elsewhere, Eleanor Roosevelt once said that human rights begin in tiny places close to home, places that are so small you can't find them on any map, and you certainly can't find them on the news at 10 or in the courts. And because human rights appears to be so lawyer dominated, and because legal aid has been so restricted in this country that you can only go to court if you're a terror suspect or an asylum seeker on the one hand, or Catherine Zeta-Jones on the other, the narrative of human rights does seem to be so extreme. And it doesn't seem to be about what it really is, which is these values, these democratic values that are as essential to democracy as having elections every few years.
Are they quite Western and Eurocentric values?
Not at all. They come from, as I say, this consensus, which is as Confucianist as it is Christian, and every other faith and non-faith discourse leading up to 1945 and beyond. I think it ultimately comes from this idea that each and every individual human life is special, and then from this word dignity, which actually has its place and its resonance in all the great world religions, and actually all the great world democratic political traditions as well.
These debates we've been having recently about Muslim women wearing headdress of a certain kind, Christian women working for British Airlines wearing a cross, those Danish cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, or even police officers saying we should have laws preventing offensive chanting on protest marches. What do you really think is going on in our society around those issues? Not just those issues. This isn't just a debate about competing rights, is it?
No.
I mean, there's something like a clash of civilizations going on.
I don't think there's a clash of civilizations at all. I think that is a mischief. It's, things like wars on terror, and clashes of civilization. That is, those metaphors are useful, mischievous devices for some people. I believe that human beings are better than not, and human beings are more the same in their inherent concerns about their families and their dignity than not. And what I think is going on more broadly in our society is that for all sorts of reasons, some legitimate and some less so, we are becoming spooked by difference, whether that's generational difference, whether we see other people's kids, not our own because they're darlings, but other people's kids as hoodies and thugs, or whether we see people of faith. Because in large parts of this country, it's not just about Muslims, it's about the idea that religion is inherently problematic, and really we'd rather wish that you just keep it indoors with your pornography and don't dare to wear anything or say anything that declares your faith, because we're not comfortable with that kind of aggressive secularism that sometimes, but not always, masks a bit of racism and just fear. And I think I think we've got an opportunity and a challenge, and it's this: are we going to be spooked by difference of whatever kind, of race or faith or generation? Are we going to be uncomfortable with it and try and shut it down and do the impossible, which is to turn us into homogenised people who all agree about everything? Or are we going to dig deep into our history and our doctrine and this framework that I believe in more than any particular policy, and say we have a way of negotiating difference, of uniting around shared values, even though you and I might disagree about whatever it is, ID cards or particular applications of the framework. But let's settle on those common values and the framework for all the debates and differences that we clearly will have.
Shami Chakrabarti, thanks for talking to me.